Hey there, skeptics. California's tackling caste discrimination. But let's dive into this with a critical lens. Caste discrimination rooted in India is too complex. While it's crucial to fight discrimination, critics worry that this bill might hinder free speech and academic discussion, potentially leading to misunderstandings and debates. Some Indian Americans and Hindus fear it unfairly targets them. They stress the importance of distinguishing between discrimination and cultural sensitivity. The bill faced backlash, debates, and even threats to lawmakers. Originally aimed at protecting caste as a category, it was later incorporated under ancestry. While supporters hail this as a civil rights win, skeptics urge caution to balance addressing discrimination with preserving open dialogue and academic freedom. This article is from CNN.com by Harmeet Kaur, and I would love to hear what the host of today's show actually thinks about it. So, Jimmy, please give me your thoughts.
I am the host of today's show.
Yeah,
Wow.
one of them.
Thank
Yep,
you. Thank you
you're
for
welcome.
the
You're welcome.
I was the
one of them.
host.
Sure.
What?
Okay. I must have misheard that. I was like, she's not giving me her job. Hey, look, you know, this is this is racism being perpetuated by religion, in my opinion, and it's leaking into American society where we really don't need that because we have enough of our own. We have 400 years plus of slavery that was perpetuated by Christianity. And we see religion bringing racial issues into other communities all around the world. Uh, take for example the Uyghur Muslims that are in concentration camps right now in China, and let's not get into concentration camps in general because we all should be well familiar of how that played out in Europe. But even in Europe now, Muslims are kind of grouped into their own societies, ostracized, if you will, but also kind of left to themselves because the government really prefers not to interact with them and allows them to police themselves. At any rate, we're looking at a district in California where higher level, if you will, or top tier cast members are discriminating against lower tier cast members, which ironically, and probably to no surprise, ironically in air quotes, are actually of darker skin tone. And so I really don't see anything wrong with this. In fact, the racial issues of another country that are brought about by their religious conflicts should not be transferred over here to our country. And those are my initial thoughts on that. And I really have no issue with the fact that this is happening. I don't see how this would infringe on academic freedom. And in any case, it would help this discussion along. So, my initial thoughts, and I'd love to kick it back to Cynthia and see what she thinks.
Kick it? Can you kick it? Yes, you can. Well, when I was looking at this story, I felt like the bottom line is basically how religion can still play a role in discrimination and in turn have adverse effects on how people are treated. So, since the article mentioned the lawsuit against Cisco in California concerning an employee who was of a lower caste getting less pay and opportunities, I actually wanted to just explore it a little bit more. So, according to an NBC article, California's lawsuit against Cisco filed in 2020 in July specifically, it alleged that the Dalit engineer received less pay and fewer opportunities, and that the defendants retaliated against him when he opposed unlawful practices contrary to the traditional order between the Dalit and higher caste. And the engineer rather worked at a team at Cisco's San Jose headquarters with Indians who all immigrated to the United States as adults, and all whom were of higher caste. And that's what the lawsuit stated. And it also mentioned that the caste system in India and all over South Asia countries, as well as the diaspora, places Dalits at the bottom of a social hierarchy. Now, even though in 1948, when India actually received their independence from Britain, India banned discrimination and on the basis of caste as law. But according to Pew, oh, we love Pew here. The survey finds that 3 in 10 Indians, 30%, identify themselves as members of general category caste, a broad grouping of the top of India's caste system that includes numerous hierarchies and sub-hierarchies. The highest caste within the general category is Brahmin. That is historically the priest and also other religious leaders who serve as educators. And just 4% of Indians today identify as Brahmin. And most Indians say that they are outside of this general category group, describing themselves as member as schedule class, often known as the Dalits, or historically by the pejorative term untouchables. Now, scheduled tribes or other backward classes, including a small percentage of whom say that par caste segregation remains prevalent in India. For example, a substantial share of Brahmins say that they would not be willing to actually accept a person that belongs to a scheduled class as a neighbor, nor would they marry one. Now, most Indians do not feel that there's a lot of caste discrimination in the country, and 2/3 of those who identify with scheduled castes or tribes say that they are not widespread discrimination against their respective groups. But they really may not reflect this experience like personally, but 82% of Indians say that they do not personally feel discriminated against. But I would like to still point out that if you are of a group that has come over, like say for instance, if you immigrated to the United States from India, or maybe like first generation, second generation born here in India of a higher caste, of course you're not going to feel discriminated against. But if there's going to be a less proclivity for any type of person that comes from a lower class, like the Dalits, this is a caste that is usually said in Hindu that you were born here because you have really fucked up karma, you did some shit, and that you have to come back and you have to perpetually be a beggar and forever poor. And you have no recourse throughout your entire life in order for you to be able to come out of your caste system and actually enter to another one. So I'm with Jimmy with this one. I think that I believe that this is actually a good thing when they actually pass this bill. And of course, this bill is not something that is just keen only to California. So it looks like that in Silicon Valley and other states as well, I believe Seattle, Washington being one of them, they did actually pass a similar bill. And this is because that this particular thing actually has happened in different places where you may have a higher concentration of Indian immigrants or first or second generation Indians that happen to work in Silicon Valley. Have like this particular discrimination as well. But I have talked enough about caste systems.
Expert.
Because this is how this works. Yes, I have expert in myself as Indian caste systems.
Experts to the left, experts to the right.
Exactly. So I'm going to actually, expert it to my I think this is my particular left that I'm seeing right now. Aaron, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I didn't know much about the caste system. I knew it existed. I heard about it before. And so I did some research, and I guess there are over 3,000 castes in the Indian caste system, and up to 25,000 subcastes. And most of them are occupation based. So if you see somebody's got a certain job, you kind of know what caste they're in. And also because the culture is very strict on cross caste marriage. Usually people marry within the same caste. One of the ways that it's easy to tell if someone's in a caste is actually by their name, by their surname. When you know someone's surname, you pretty much know what caste they belong in, and it becomes really easy just by knowing someone's name. I mean, you don't even have to see them or know them. You don't know what caste they're in. So really, really easy to discriminate against somebody in different castes. And I just don't understand the objection to bills like this, because when you try to protecting some groups' rights is really protecting your rights, because you may be at the top of the ladder today, but societies change, demographics change. You're not going to be at the top of your group may not be at the top of the list, and you maybe during your lifetime you will be, but in your kids' lifetime, your grandkids' lifetime, are they going to be at the top? Chances are probably not, especially the way the demographics in the United States are changing. It's going to be minority white here in the not too distant future. And so it's really important that we protect everybody's rights, not just the people at the top's rights. And so everybody should be supporting bills like this that support and prevent discrimination of any kind. Phoebe?
I've got mixed feelings about this.
No.
California is a weird place.
Yes, it is.
It passes legislation like this, but it says prison slavery is fine. It says that affirmative action is wrong, yet it has some of the most expansive anti-discrimination laws in America. It's a weird mix of contrasts. In 1996, California voted to end affirmative action in the state, one of the first states to end affirmative action. And it said that prison slavery is fine recently. Indentured servitude amongst prisoners is fine. Working for nothing just to be because you're a prisoner is fine. Yet they've passed this bill. It's odd. It's an odd mix of what California is. It goes to the heart of the mess that trying to pass laws like this is. California is an odd part of America. But this bill and this bill's opponents in particular have one thing against them. They perpetuate the myth, and as a Brit, I know this is a myth, that you cannot be racist against somebody who is of the same race as you. That is nonsense. As a Brit, we've been racist against other people who are also British for a bloody long time. It's called class. As Reginald D. Hunter said, in America, we do racism against people who look different to us. In Britain, you do racism against people who look the same as you. You've gone to the next level of racism. You've moved away from this, you are different from me, to I don't like you because you're the same as me. And this is where we are with the opponents of this bill. They're saying that it's culture, it's this, it's bollocks. It's absolute bollocks. It's large, stinking bollocks floating around as an excuse to perpetuate racism. Which is why I have an issue with this bill. Because I don't think it's necessary. If we were to just say caste discrimination is another form of racism, it's already covered. We say discrimination on the grounds of gender identity is sex discrimination. We don't need a new law to tell us what we already know to be true. So why are we doing it? The law is already there, and we've inflamed the culture warriors again. When if you just were to turn around and say, look, caste discrimination is racism, and I don't care what you call it, how you dress it up, what your definitions of racism are, it's racism. You as an Indian person see a different Indian person as lesser because they're a different type of Indian person. That's caste discrimination. That's racism from Indian people to other Indian people. It's just the same as me, a white Briton from the south of England, turning around and saying a Scouser or a Geordie or a Brummie is lesser than me just because they're a Geordie, a Scouser or a Brummie. It's exactly the same. And Jimmy, are you going to be exactly the same? Or are you going to be different?
I think I'm going to be different as far as opinion goes, in agreeing with you on that, Phoebe. That was a very well thought out response, but I don't think it's exactly the same. I think that there are racial divisions in the caste systems in India, and I think that that helps inflame the Indian on Indian or Southeast Asian versus Southeast Asian hate. Uh, so something I found interesting. So while the Dalit people are typically a lot darker skinned, in Afghanistan, we see the same thing with the people who are considered lower class people. Those are the Hazara people. What the connection I found interesting between Afghanistan and India is that Aisha Wahab, the author of this bill from District 10 in California, is actually from Afghanistan and probably sees this a lot, especially being a woman. Women in Afghanistan are discriminated against more than any other group, regardless of race, and so is probably sympathetic to the idea that racial guidelines do exist. I think the law is necessary because, well, even if we said it was racism, I don't know that it would still be covered on paper because people will find loopholes to exploit any kind of racism that they can. And to Cynthia's point,
just stop you there.
Go ahead.
The lawyer in me says that the arguments made here is that this bill is prima facie unconstitutional because it's national origin discrimination. The Constitution says, well, not the Constitution, the Civil Rights Act says you can't discriminate based on national origin. And if this bill is seen to be singling out people of a specific national origin, it could be unconstitutional on its face.
You're correct. You're 100% correct. I think where the extra measure comes in is, like I said, to Cynthia's point. So caste was outlawed theoretically in India in 1948, yet we still see these kinds of racial divisions and discrimination going forward. Just like in our own country, the 13th Amendment ended slavery, but that didn't stop Jim Crow. It didn't stop Black people from not being able to share water fountains after they returned from war to defend a country that hated them. On paper, things can be wrong, but in practice, things are on paper, things can look right, but in practice are still very wrong. And I think that's what we see here. I think we see Aisha Wahab kind of taking the initiative to plug up any possible holes. She comes from a district that's 53% South Asian or Asian or South Asian, compared to California, which is only 16.3% Asian. So I could see where she feels like she might have the burden to bear with passing this kind of legislation. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. I think that what's on paper versus what's in practice is a very ugly difference, a very ugly contrast. And what the lawmakers here, or at least what one lawmaker here is doing, is trying to use their own experience to stop any kind of poor excuse or loophole in continuing this kind of discrimination.
Go ahead, Phoebe.
Cynthia, sorry. Go ahead.
You want me to come back in? You want me to come back in on that? You want me to come back in on that point specifically? Then
yes.
Is legislating the right way to go about this? Are we trying to crack a nut with a sledgehammer here? Is legislating on this the right way to go about it? Because if the legislation is going to do bugger all, then why are we wasting the time passing legislation that's just going to be summarily ignored? And we're weaponizing legislating thing as we see in Florida. My existence is weaponized in Florida by the passing of laws which are unenforceable.
So is mine.
How and why are we weaponizing legislation here into a state where we are passing laws that are platitudinal, detritus, flotsam and jetsam that would make Jim Crow laugh? This is some of these things around here. They're like shivers looking for a spine. It's so absurd. It would make a cat laugh. I tell you, it would make a cat laugh.
I'm really confused. I don't understand how you can compare this to Jim Crow. This is legislation that says you can't discriminate against someone based on their caste. I'm confused.
I'm not saying that this is the same as Jim Crow. I'm saying this is probably not the right way to go about things. Because when you pass something on one side of the spectrum, legislation like this, you fire up the other side to pass legislation of the exact opposite. And when you fire up both sides, you end up with this culture war nonsense, textbook sanitization in Florida, with black people who are slaves being told that they should be grateful to have been slaves and they learned things from it, just in the same way that the people who are now opposing this are trying to sanitize textbooks to remove the things that they don't like in it because they don't want to look in the mirror. They don't want to look in the mirror and say, can I be a better person about this? When you inflame on the left, you inflame on the right.
But the right's already inflamed. The right is already so far inflamed that the left has to fight fire with fire. And I think that aiming legislation to interrupt or to suppress discrimination, I think that's what's happening. I don't think that's the same thing as what's happening in Florida. I am disgusted with what's happening in Florida against trans people and against LGBTQ and African Americans. I don't see it the same.
Do you think
we're a nation
that
of laws?
Democrats should gerrymander because Republicans gerrymander?
Well, I think that I would like to just go ahead and try to put this in a nice, neat bow. I'm going to try. Phoebe, I don't completely disagree with you. I don't know how you all feel about Ayn Rand. Some people.
Ayn Rand.
Ayn Rand,
know, the author, not the politician named after the author.
Right. Exactly. But some people love her, feel like, her philosophy is top notch. Some people think that, if they had a chance to like stab her all over again so that she can die again, they would. But one of the things that she said that is pretty interesting, when the civil rights movement was happening back in the 1950s and 60s, she was asked, when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was being introduced, that if she agreed with it, and she said no. And even Malcolm X agreed with her as well, saying that the laws that we have already in the Constitution are good enough in order for them to for it to actually answer the issues that we are facing today. The problem is that we don't enforce them. And I could actually make the same case here, specifically in California, when you actually have a person, like I mentioned, the engineer who happened to be of Dalit origin, who were being discriminated against by his coworkers and not being able to get promotions just because of his caste. I mean, there's a possibility that could have went straight under the 14th Amendment. But to the other point, do we need more legislation? Yes and no. And the reason why I say yes and no is because no to my other point. However, I say yes because unfortunately, the precedent that we have set in the United States is that we use legislation to fix a fuck up from a previous legislation. That's just kind of how we work, whether if it's on the federal level versus where this on in states. Because like the constitutions on how they are actually formulated mirror, even though like states will vary as far as like, what amendment is here and what amendment is there. But as far as like the framework is concerned, that's how our constitutions work as far as law. If we have a real fucked up law or real fucked up legislation previous to the one, we try to fix it with another piece of legislation. And if they felt that the California Constitution was not as robust enough to protect people who happen to be of a different origin from the United States that are still carrying around these particular sensibilities from India and the diaspora that actually has Hindi notions, then they would feel that that actually fixing it with actual legislation to protect people from being discriminated against in their workplaces and beyond is absolutely necessary. And unfortunately, I don't know how any other way to fix it unless you have to say you need to enforce the laws that are already on the books. But we have a problem with that in the United States as well. But
Hear,
what
hear.
we don't, but what we don't have a problem with, and I think that Phoebe, you have one more thing to say because you were muted, darling. Go ahead and go ahead and chime on in.
Then why don't we just make the argument of just wholesale get rid of large chunks of legislation which is just there to contradict and conflict with other pieces of legislation? Why are we adding more and more and more and more and more and forgetting what the original issue was?
You know why?
The Constitution's not a big document.
You know
Not
why?
a big document.
You know why?
Because it keeps me employed.
Yes, it keeps all of us employed, and it keeps us people from watching us, and we are not elected officials, because then we can make that argument. But one thing that you can do, dear listener, if you want to see more arguments amongst us, because we've had plenty, click here.